A woman discovers a buried bunker by the lake. The rusted hatch has strange symbols glowing faintly. She feels a strange pull toward it and hears an eerie sound coming from inside. What she thought was an old shelter hides something dangerous, something that was never meant to be found. The morning sun glittered on the surface of the lake, its serene beauty masking the secrets below. Sarah Green tugged on Max's leash, urging the dog to stay on the trail. "Max, heel!" she called out, but Max's ears perked and he bolted toward the tree line. "Max!" she shouted, her boots crunching over the uneven ground. She found him furiously digging at the base of a large tree, barking at something partially buried in the earth. "What is it, boy?" Sarah knelt beside him, brushing away the dirt. Her hands froze as she revealed a rusted, circular hatch embedded in the ground. Strange symbols, weathered but still visible, adorned its surface. "What on earth?" she murmured. Her stomach churned, a mix of curiosity and unease. She pulled out her phone, snapping a picture before dialing the local police. "You won't believe what I just found." Minutes later, the distant wail of sirens echoed through the trees. As the first squad car pulled up, a young officer emerged, his brow furrowed. "You said you found a hatch?" Sarah pointed toward the metallic structure. The officer ran a hand over the symbols. "This doesn't look like anything I've ever seen. Let's call in backup." As Sarah waited, a low, eerie hum began emanating from beneath the ground. She felt the vibrations under her feet and stepped back instinctively. "What's that sound?" she whispered, her pulse quickening. The officer looked up at her, his face pale. "I think we just opened a can of worms." The police cruiser doors slammed shut in unison as a team of officers arrived, their presence slicing through the tranquility of the lakeside. Officer Kyle Manning, tall and broad-shouldered with a sharp intensity in his eyes, stepped forward. His uniform was crisp, his demeanor calm but curious. "All right, Ms. Green," Kyle said, his voice steady. "Let's see what we're dealing with here." Sarah stood back, watching as Kyle and his team approached the hatch. Max growled low, his hackles raised. Sarah knelt to soothe him, her hands shaking slightly. Something about the hatch felt wrong, but she couldn't explain it. Kyle crouched down, running his gloved fingers over the metallic surface. His brow furrowed as he traced the strange symbols etched into the steel. "These markings, they're not like anything I've seen before," he muttered. "Do you think it's an old storm shelter?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling despite her effort to sound composed. Kyle didn't answer immediately. He gestured for one of the officers, a stocky man named Joe, to bring over their toolkit. "Maybe, or it could be military, but I've never seen this kind of craftsmanship on anything local." Joe handed Kyle a crowbar, and the officer wedged it under the hatch's handle. The metal groaned, but didn't budge. "It's rusted shut," Kyle said. "Joe, give me a hand." As the two officers strained against the hatch, Sarah glanced nervously at the surrounding trees. A cold breeze swept across the lake, rustling the leaves and sending a shiver down her spine. She felt an inexplicable urge to leave, to put as much distance as possible between herself and that bunker. "I don't think this is a good idea," Sarah said, stepping closer. "What if it's dangerous?" Kyle paused, meeting her gaze. His eyes softened, but his voice was firm. "We'll take every precaution, but we can't ignore something like this. If there's any chance this could pose a risk to the public, it's our job to find out." With a final push, the hatch creaked open, releasing a blast of stale, putrid air. Sarah gagged, covering her nose with her sleeve. The officers stepped back, coughing and fanning the air in front of their faces. "God," Joe said, grimacing. "Smells like something died down there." Kyle shone a flashlight into the dark opening, revealing a narrow, rusted staircase descending into the shadows. Dust motes danced in the beam of light. "Stay here," he instructed Sarah. "We'll check it out." "Wait," she blurted, her anxiety mounting. "What if it's unstable? What if the air is toxic?" Kyle hesitated, nodding toward one of his team. "Smith, grab the masks and the portable monitor." Officer Smith retrieved a small case from the cruiser and handed out respirator masks and a handheld air quality device. After securing the mask over his face, Kyle descended cautiously, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. Joe and Smith followed close behind, their boots clanging on the metal steps. Sarah stood by the hatch, clutching Max's leash tightly. The dog whined, tugging against her grip as if to follow the officers. The sound of their footsteps echoed until it faded into the depths. "Anything down there?" Sarah called after a minute of silence. Kyle's voice crackled over his radio. "There's a corridor and some kind of door. Looks reinforced." "Reinforced?" Sarah echoed under her breath, her pulse quickening. More silence. Then static burst through the radio, followed by Joe's voice. "You need to see this, Kyle. Looks like equipment? Maybe military? Definitely old." "What kind of equipment?" Kyle's reply came with an edge of unease. Joe's voice faltered. I'm not sure. It's weird, and there's some kind of writing, but it's not in English." A sudden clatter echoed up the stairs, making Sarah jump. She gripped Max's leash so tightly her knuckles turned white. "What's going on?" she shouted down. Another burst of static, followed by Kyle's voice, sharp and urgent. "Everyone out, now!" The officers reappeared moments later, their movements quick and deliberate. Kyle's face, pale and tight-lipped behind the respirator, betrayed the composure he had shown earlier. "What did you find?" Sarah demanded as the men emerged into the open air. Kyle exchanged a look with Joe, then turned to Sarah. "It's not safe down there. We're calling in a specialized team." "What do you mean, not safe?" Sarah pressed. Kyle hesitated, his jaw tightening. "There's something strange about that bunker. Something that doesn't add up." Before Sarah could respond, a low, rhythmic hum began to emanate from the open hatch. It was barely audible at first, like the buzz of an old generator, but it quickly grew louder, resonating through the ground beneath their feet. Max barked furiously, pulling against his leash. Sarah stumbled back, her heart pounding as the sound seemed to pierce through her chest. Kyle stared at the hatch, his hand hovering over the radio clipped to his vest. "Get everyone back," he barked, his voice tight with urgency. "And cordon off the area. No one goes near this thing until we figure out what we're dealing with." The hum deepened, vibrating the air like an invisible force. As the officers scrambled to secure the perimeter, Sarah couldn't tear her eyes away from the dark opening. Something inside her whispered that they had uncovered something far more dangerous than anyone could have imagined, and it wasn't going to stay hidden for long. The air hung thick with tension as the rhythmic hum from the hatch grew louder, a pulsing vibration that seemed to come not just from below, but from the earth itself. Sarah backed away, pulling Max along, while Kyle barked orders to his team. The officers scrambled to set up a perimeter, marking the area with bright yellow tape. "Smith, get the environmental team on the line," Kyle said, his tone clipped. "I want someone here with the right equipment, now." Sarah stepped forward, her voice trembling. "What was down there? What did you see?" Kyle glanced at her, his jaw tightening. "It's better if you don't know. For now, stay back. Please." "I'm not leaving," Sarah said, her fear giving way to defiance. "I found that thing. I deserve to know what's going on." Before Kyle could reply, Officer Joe emerged from his cruiser, holding a handheld monitor. "Kyle, we've got elevated readings," he said, his voice low. "Radiation levels are spiking." "Radiation?" Sarah repeated, her breath catching. Kyle shot her a warning look. "We've got it under control." Turning to Joe, he added, "How bad?" Joe shook his head, the monitor in his hands beeping steadily. "Not critical, but it's climbing fast. This thing's been sealed for decades. Whatever's down there, it's waking up." The hum from the hatch suddenly ceased, plunging the area into an eerie silence. Everyone froze, their eyes fixed on the dark opening. Then came the faintest sound, a metallic scrape, like something shifting deep within. Sarah's stomach churned as a fresh wave of unease swept over her. She felt an inexplicable pull toward the bunker, like an unseen force beckoning her closer. Max barked again, his teeth bared. "What was that?" Smith muttered, his hand instinctively moving toward the firearm at his hip. Kyle moved closer to the hatch, his flashlight trained on the rusted steps leading down. "Stay sharp," he warned. We're not taking any chances." Against the protests of his team, Kyle descended once more, his footsteps echoing hollowly as he disappeared into the darkness. Sarah hovered at the edge, her breath quickening. "Why is he going back down there?" she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. Joe, who had stayed behind, muttered, "Because he's too stubborn to wait for backup." The radio crackled, and Kyle's voice came through, calm but strained. "It's still quiet, but there's another room down here, looks like some kind of lab." Joe grabbed his own flashlight and nodded at Smith. "Let's go." "No," Sarah blurted, surprising even herself. "Don't go down there. Just wait for help." Joe hesitated, glancing at her before following Smith into the hatch. The faint glow of their flashlights bobbed in the darkness as they joined Kyle. Moments passed. Then came a muffled shout, followed by static on the radio. "Kyle!" Sarah called, her voice cracking. The radio burst to life with garbled noise, followed by Kyle's sharp command. "Get up here, now!" Joe and Smith scrambled back up the stairs, their faces pale, their breaths ragged. Behind them, Kyle emerged, carrying an old, dust-covered case. Its locks were broken, its surface etched with the same strange symbols as the hatch. "What is that?" Sarah asked, her voice shaking. Kyle set the case down on the ground and crouched beside it. "We found it in the second room," he said, unfastening the rusty hinges. "And that's not all. There's equipment down there. Old, military, I think, and papers, documents written in a mix of languages. Some of it looks German, some Russian." Joe crossed his arms. "That doesn't explain what's in the box." Kyle flipped the lid open, revealing a small object nestled inside. It was a crystal-like artifact glowing faintly with an otherworldly light. Its surface shimmered as though alive, casting shifting patterns on the inside of the case. Sarah's breath hitched. What is that thing?" Kyle didn't answer. He reached for the radio, but before he could speak, the glow intensified. A deep hum resonated from the artifact, making the ground tremble. Then it happened. Joe suddenly dropped to his knees, clutching his head. I can't think," he gasped. His face twisted in agony as he convulsed, collapsing onto the ground. "Joe!" Kyle shouted, moving to help him. Sarah froze, fear rooting her in place as the glow from the artifact pulsed like a heartbeat. Max whined, pulling harder on his leash, but Sarah barely noticed. Kyle managed to pull Joe away from the case, his hands shaking as he slammed the lid shut. The artifact's glow dimmed instantly, the hum cutting off like a severed wire. Joe groaned, his breathing shallow but steady. Kyle glanced at Sarah, his expression grim. "Get back to town," he said, "and don't tell anyone about this, not yet." "But—" "Go!" Kyle barked, his voice sharp with authority. Sarah hesitated for only a moment before turning and running, Max pulling her along. Her mind raced with questions, but one thought overpowered them all. She wasn't sure what they'd found beneath the earth, but whatever it wasn't meant to be uncovered. The drive back to town was a blur of adrenaline and unease. Sarah gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white, Max panting nervously in the back seat. Her mind replayed the scene at the lake, the bunker, the artifact, the way the air seemed to pulse with something unnatural. By the time she reached her small lakeside cottage, the late afternoon sky had darkened, heavy with clouds. Rain threatened to fall, but Sarah barely noticed as she ushered Max inside and collapsed onto the couch. "Okay, boy," she whispered, scratching Max's head to calm them both. "What the hell was that thing?" Max didn't respond, of course, but his whining hadn't stopped. He paced the room, occasionally glancing at the window as if expecting something, or someone, to appear. The hum, the glow, the way Joe had crumpled like a puppet with its strings cut. It didn't feel real, yet Sarah couldn't shake the memory of it. She pulled out her phone, scrolling through the pictures she'd taken of the hatch and the symbols before the police arrived. "What does it mean?" she murmured to herself. The markings looked ancient, with sharp, angular lines that seemed oddly deliberate, almost ritualistic. Her fingers hovered over the search bar. She hesitated, unsure of what to even type. Then, with a deep breath, she entered. Ancient Symbols, Metallic Bunker. Pages of unrelated results flooded her screen. Storm shelters, conspiracy theories, forgotten Cold War installations. None of it seemed relevant, but one link caught her eye. Unidentified bunker symbols, anomalies in Cold War relics. She clicked the link, her curiosity outweighing her fear. The article described a series of bunkers discovered in the 1970s, built during the height of the Cold War. While most were straightforward military structures, a few contained strange markings etched into the walls, floors, and ceilings, symbols that defied translation. One image sent a chill down Sarah's spine. It was identical to the markings on the hatch she had found. A notification buzzed, startling her. It was a text from Kyle. "We're sealing the site. Do not talk to anyone. Stay home tonight." Stay home. That was all he had to say after what she'd witnessed. Her frustration grew, but there was no time to reply. A sudden, low rumble filled the air, shaking the walls of her cottage. Max barked wildly, his claws scraping the floor as he darted to the window. Sarah followed, pulling back the curtain. At first, she saw nothing but the darkened woods that lined her property. Then the rumble came again, and the ground outside trembled. "What the—" A bright flash lit up the sky in the direction of the lake, followed by an ear-splitting crack as if lightning had struck the earth itself. The flash was brief, but Sarah caught enough to see the outline of the trees bending unnaturally toward the lake, as if drawn by an invisible force. Max growled low, and Sarah's pulse quickened. Whatever was happening, it wasn't over. Kyle stood near the hatch, his team tense and on edge. Joe sat slumped against a tree, pale but coherent. Smith paced the perimeter, muttering to himself about backup that was taking too long to arrive. Kyle stared at the closed case containing the artifact. Even sealed, it radiated a faint warmth, as if it were alive. "This isn't just some relic," Kyle said aloud, his voice low. "No kidding," Smith replied, keeping his distance. "What do you think it is? Alien? Government experiment gone wrong?" Kyle shook his head. "I don't know, but I don't think we're supposed to have it." Suddenly, a tremor rippled through the ground, making the trees sway. The radio on Kyle's vest crackled to life, a distorted voice barely audible through the static. "Kyle, you there? This is dispatch. Strange readings. Team is—" The signal cut out entirely, replaced by a deep hum that sent chills down Kyle's spine. Smith froze mid-step. "That's the same sound from before." Kyle nodded, gripping his flashlight. "Joe, stay here. Smith, with me. We're securing the hatch until backup arrives." Smith hesitated but followed, the two men descending the steps once again. The air inside the bunker was thicker this time, charged with an unexplainable energy. Their flashlights flickered as they moved deeper, passing through the first room of rusted equipment. The hum grew louder with each step. "It's coming from the second room," Kyle whispered. As they entered, the sight before them made them stop in their tracks. The equipment was no longer dormant. Screens that had been blank now flickered with static. Dials and gauges spun erratically, their needles jumping as if powered by something invisible. And in the center of the room, where the artifact had been, a faint glow pulsed from the floor itself. "What is this place?" Smith breathed, his voice barely audible. Kyle stepped closer to the glowing spot, his instincts screaming at him to leave, but his curiosity pulling him forward. The glow intensified, and the hum shifted, almost becoming a whisper. Soft, incomprehensible, but undeniably there. Then the ground beneath their feet cracked. "Run!" Kyle shouted, grabbing Smith's arm and yanking him back. The floor caved in, revealing a dark, yawning void beneath. For a moment they both stood frozen, staring into the abyss. Then, from the darkness, came a sound neither of them would ever forget. A deep, guttural growl, echoing up from the depths like the roar of something ancient and angry. Back at her cottage, Sarah clutched her head as a sharp pain pierced her temples. Her vision blurred, and for a moment she wasn't in her living room anymore. She was standing at the edge of the lake, the water unnaturally still. The sky above her was pitch black, devoid of stars or moonlight. In the distance, she saw a figure, a man standing by the open hatch, his face obscured but his presence overwhelming. The man turned toward her, and though she couldn't see his eyes, she felt them boring into her. His voice echoed in her mind, low and resonant. "You must choose." Sarah jolted awake, gasping for breath. The pain in her head faded, but the words lingered, chilling her to the bone. "What is happening to me?" she whispered. Max whined softly, resting his head on her lap. Outside, the rain began to fall, the drops tapping against the windows like 1,000 tiny warnings. She couldn't shake the feeling that the bunker wasn't just a discovery. It was a test. The rain poured relentlessly, drumming against Sarah's cottage windows as though nature itself was warning her. She sat at the kitchen table, staring at her laptop. On the screen, the open article about unexplained bunkers offered more questions than answers. Her mind raced with images: the glowing artifact, the collapsing floor, the man in her vision. Max sat at her feet, his head on her lap, growling softly at the thunder rolling in the distance. She couldn't just sit here. Something about the bunker and the artifact felt tied to her, not just because she found it, but because of the strange pull she felt. The vision of the man by the lake echoed in her thoughts. You must choose. But choose what? And why her? A knock at the door made her jump. Max barked sharply, bolting upright. "Kyle!" she called out hesitantly, approaching the door. She peeked through the window to see him standing there, rain-soaked and tense, his flashlight in hand. When she opened the door, his expression confirmed her worst fears. "You need to leave town," Kyle said, stepping inside. Water dripped from his jacket onto the hardwood floor. "What are you talking about?" Sarah demanded. "What happened at the bunker?" Kyle hesitated, glancing at Max, who barked again before retreating to Sarah's side. "There's something alive down there," he said finally. "Something we don't understand." Sarah's breath caught. "Alive? What do you mean? Like an animal? A person?" Kyle shook his head. "I don't know, but whatever it is, it's not natural." Officer Joe sat in the cruiser, his breathing shallow as he stared at his shaking hands. The convulsions had stopped, but his body ached, and his mind felt foggy. The rhythmic hum from earlier was gone, but he swore he could still hear whispers, faint, like the murmurs of voices just beyond reach. "Joe, you good?" Smith asked, stepping up to the car, his voice shaky. Joe turned his head slowly, his eyes unfocused. "It's still in my head," he muttered. Smith glanced toward the hatch, now sealed temporarily with a metal barrier. The glow from the artifact had faded, but the presence it left behind lingered. "Look, we'll get you checked out when backup gets here," Smith said, trying to sound reassuring, but deep down, he didn't believe his own words. Back at the cottage, Sarah paced as Kyle explained what had happened after the floor collapsed. "We heard something," Kyle said, his voice low. "Not human. It was growling, like it was furious we were there. The ground gave way and it felt like the whole place was alive." "Alive?" Sarah whispered. "That doesn't make any sense." Kyle's jaw tightened. "I know how it sounds, but you saw that artifact. You felt it, didn't you? It's not just a piece of Cold War junk. It's something else. Something dangerous." A memory surfaced in Sarah's mind, unbidden. Her grandfather, who had lived on the edge of the lake before her, had once told her stories about strange noises he heard at night. He'd joked about a beast beneath the waves, but she'd never taken him seriously. "What if my grandfather knew about this?" she muttered aloud. Kyle frowned. "What do you mean?" Sarah grabbed an old family photo album from a shelf, flipping through its yellowed pages. She stopped at a picture of her grandfather standing by the lake with a group of men in military uniforms. He worked for the government back in the 40s and 50s. He always said it was classified. Kyle leaned over to study the photo. "These uniforms, they're military, but not just U.S. forces." He pointed to an insignia on one man's arm. "That's Soviet." "What would Soviet soldiers be doing here?" Sarah asked, her stomach churning. "Maybe the same thing that led to that bunker," Kyle said grimly. "Whatever it was, it looks like they were working together on something they shouldn't have." As Kyle prepared to leave, his radio crackled to life. Static filled the room, followed by a distorted voice. All units. Dispatch. Responding. Unusual. Activity. Kyle grabbed the radio, his expression sharp. Dispatch. Repeat. What's the situation? More static, then reports of disturbances. Town center. Backup. En route. Disturbances? Sarah asked. What kind of disturbances? Kyle shook his head. I don't know, but it can't be a coincidence. He grabbed his flashlight and headed for the door. Stay here. Lock your doors. Don't answer to anyone but me. Kyle, wait, Sarah called after him. You can't just leave me here without answers. He stopped, his shoulders tense. Sarah, whatever's happening, it's bigger than both of us. I'll come back for you, but for now, stay safe. And with that, he disappeared into the rain-soaked night. Downtown, the streets were eerily deserted. A heavy mist clung to the air, distorting the glow of the streetlights. Kyle pulled up to the scene of the reported disturbance, where several cars were abandoned in the middle of the road. Their doors hung open, and belongings were scattered across the pavement. What the hell happened here? He muttered, stepping out of the cruiser. A low growl echoed through the mist, stopping him in his tracks. It wasn't a dog or any animal he recognized. It was deeper, almost resonant, like the sound was coming from everywhere at once. Kyle gripped his flashlight tightly, scanning the street. Movement flickered at the edge of his vision, but when he turned, there was nothing there. Suddenly, his radio burst to life, but the words were garbled and broken. He caught fragments. Something. Moving. Shadows. Can't. The growl came again, louder this time, and Kyle instinctively drew his weapon. But no amount of training had prepared him for what stepped out of the mist. It was humanoid, but distorted, its limbs too long, its eyes glowing faintly with an unnatural light. It moved jerkily, like a marionette pulled by unseen strings. Kyle backed away, his breath coming in sharp gasps. "What the hell are you?" he whispered. The creature tilted its head as if studying him. Then it opened its mouth, and from it came not a roar, but a chorus of overlapping voices, whispering words Kyle couldn't understand. Back at the cottage, Sarah jolted awake from another vision. This time, she was standing in the heart of the bunker, the artifact glowing brightly before her. The man from her first vision was there, his face still obscured. "You must choose," he said again, his voice echoing in her mind. "What am I choosing?" she demanded. "Tell me!" But the man only pointed toward the artifact, which pulsed with an intense light, filling her vision until she woke up. Max barked sharply, snapping her out of the trance. She glanced at the window and froze. The same faint glow from her vision was now emanating from the direction of the lake. Sarah knew she couldn't wait for Kyle to return. The pull was too strong, the connection too real. "I have to go back," she whispered, grabbing her coat and flashlight. Max whined in protest, but Sarah couldn't ignore the feeling that whatever was happening at the bunker was tied to her and to her family's past. Sarah returned to the bunker, driven by the inexplicable pull of the artifact. She descended into the depths, guided by visions that became clearer with each step. The bunker's air was heavy, its walls trembling with an unseen force. At the center of the collapsed chamber, the artifact pulsed violently, its light illuminating the twisted remains of Cold War experiments, machines, skeletons, and symbols meant to contain what lay within. Kyle, battling his own terror in town, managed to escape the shadowy creature. Guided by a desperate instinct, he raced back to the bunker, his gut telling him Sarah was in danger. He arrived just as the artifact's light enveloped Sarah, her figure silhouetted against the blinding glow. "Sarah, don't!" Kyle shouted, but it was too late. With a trembling hand, Sarah touched the artifact and the voices she'd been hearing silenced in an instant. The bunker stilled, and the oppressive energy dissipated. A surge of memories flooded her mind. Not just her own, but echoes of the experiments conducted there, of her grandfather's role in the project, and the entity's origin. The artifact wasn't a power source. It was a prison. The man in her visions appeared once more, his form clearer now, revealing a uniform matching those in her grandfather's photos. His voice was calm but resolute. "You have set it free. Now it must return." The artifact shattered into a million fragments, its energy drawn into the void where the entity had been contained. A final pulse of light swept through the bunker, collapsing it entirely and sealing it beneath the earth forever. Kyle dragged Sarah from the wreckage as the bunker imploded, leaving nothing but scorched earth and a lingering silence. The town, too, seemed to breathe easier. Whatever had been awakened was now gone, or perhaps, finally, at peace. In the days that followed, the town slowly returned to normal. The mist cleared, and the strange disturbances ceased. Kyle and Sarah agreed to keep the events of the bunker a secret, knowing the truth would only raise questions they couldn't answer. As Sarah sat on her porch, staring out at the lake, she clutched one of the artifact's fragments she had kept, a tiny shard that glimmered faintly in the sunlight. The voices were gone, but the sense of connection remained. Her grandfather's secrets were buried, but she now understood his warnings. Some discoveries are meant to remain hidden. What would you do if you uncovered a secret so dangerous it could change everything? Sarah's discovery led to an incredible journey of mystery, danger, and courage. But it came with a cost. If you enjoyed this suspenseful story filled with twists and turns, make sure to like this video and share your thoughts in the comments. What do you think was truly hidden in that bunker? Subscribe for more gripping stories like this, and hit the bell icon so you never miss an upload. And if you're ready for another mind-blowing tale, click here to watch our next video about an eerie discovery in an abandoned schoolhouse that will leave you speechless. Thanks for watching, and stay curious.